Alright, in this video we're going to take a look at what happens once you make your primitive objects editable and how you can go in and make selections as well as modeling options for those components. So we're going to start, I'm just going to pull out a simple primitive here. And so as we've discussed in previous lessons, before we make this object editable, we're just dealing with the entire shape. And we have options for the segmentation, oftentimes the type of primitive, and this works both with our parametric primitives as well as our spline-based and NURB objects that we create as well. So I'm just going to change this really quickly to a hexahedron. And so once I make this object editable, I'm going to have the ability to go in and select components of these shapes. Now, one thing I do want to mention is object selection is of course very important as well. And there are multiple ways we can go about this. So number one, we can make selections right inside the viewport. For example, I can shift click right inside the viewport here and select multiple shapes right inside. If I then control click, I can remove from that selection individually. So shift will add and control will remove. We also have the ability to do these same type things right inside the object manager. So I can shift click to select multiple objects here, and of course control click to remove those. The other thing I can do is drag a marquee within the object manager, and that also allows me to select multiple objects very simply. Now I'm going to get rid of these extra objects here, and I'm going to make this sphere editable. So we have the ability to do that by clicking on the Make Editable button, or as you can see at the bottom by pressing the C key, which will also convert this to a polygonal object. So if you look in here, you'll notice that the icon has changed, and may not notice a visible difference here, but once I go in and enable any of my components, they'll now be available to edit. So we have our points, our edges, and our polygons. Now selecting these is very simple. We have some basic selection options up here with the selection tool, followed by the rectangular selection, lasso, and polygon selection tools. If you were familiar with Photoshop or other editing programs, you're probably familiar with these selection options. One thing that may be a little bit different here is if I have the live selection tool, I can click and then again shift click to add to an existing selection. So just as we did with objects before, we can do that with components as well. And I can control click to remove individually from a given selection. I'm going to turn my selection radius down a little bit. This will make it easier just to get individual polygons selected. You can also paint selection with the live selection tool. So if I just click and drag around, I can kind of paint an area that I want selected. And again, I can shift and paint other areas or add individually. And I can control paint as well to remove selections. If I click in an empty area of the viewport, I'll quickly deselect all. Same with our points and our edges as well. Now, some other options are the rectangular selection tool. I'm going to show this with the polygon tool. So you'll notice that by default, it only selects those areas that are totally encompassed by the rectangular marquee that I draw out. If I want it to select anything it touches, I can turn on tolerant selection, and now anywhere that is any polygon that's touched by the rectangular marquee will be part of that selection. Now, another thing that will be available within all of these options is the only select visible elements. If that's unchecked, that means when I select across a polygonal surface, it not only selects it where I can see it in the viewport, but it'll actually select all the way through the model. And so that is typically extremely helpful with symmetrical modeling and things of that nature. It can also oftentimes be a little tricky if you've forgotten that you have enabled that setting. So it's one you have to remember to keep going back to make sure you're not accidentally selecting back faces. So now if I make a similar selection with only select visible elements disabled, you'll notice I've gone through the model. So these are all the basic selection tools we have right here, but there are others that we have as well. If I press the V key, this basically pulls out the hotbar. That would be the same as opening up the selection menu. But I have lots of options here under select. So I just want to go through a couple of the most important ones here. Loop selection allows me to grab loops of selections. Makes sense. So really handy for all kinds of modeling. And also the fill select is quite handy as well. So sometimes you can get to hard to reach places by selecting a loop outside of that area and then use the fill select to get everything else. So you can notice that if I come to one side or the other, it's going to fill outside of that loop. And if I want the existing selection included in that, all I have to do is hold the Shift key and it would be added to this selection. So a good way to get a selection. You'll also see ring selection and outline selection, again, useful at times, as well as other commands like grow selection. So again, if I use grow selection, it takes that next loop. These are all really helpful when establishing selections for modeling or for texturing. When you're trying to restrict a texture only to a certain part of your selection, this is very handy as well. So when you have a selection, the next part is modeling, actually getting in and editing those components. So we have our three basic tools that work on both an object level and a component level. So for example, if we wanted to move this selection, we could do that. We could scale this selection, and we could rotate this selection as well. We also have some other very powerful modeling tools. And if you go to the mesh menu, and again, this is, you can get to these tools in different ways. Obviously, the menus here, we have the create tool, subset. For spline shapes, we have spline tools. We have transform tools here. So lots of options for getting to these. And oftentimes, if you look, they'll have shortcuts available. A lot of these are the M key. So if you press the M key, you'll get a list of the tools that are accessible from this menu. So a lot of times that's much easier than going up and trying to find it from the different options within the mesh menu. You can just click the M key. That'll pull up all these options. So I know that if I wanted to, for example, get the knife tool, if I wanted to cut through a certain selection of polygons, let's say I went up here to my recently used tools, I can grab the loop select tool, make a selection, then I could go to the M key. Now I know that the knife key shortcut is just the K key, but if I go to the M key, it shows me, so if I'm not familiar with all the different shortcuts, I can just learn the M key, and that'll get me a good way the way through. So then I press the K key, and I'm going to set this to loop mode, and then it would allow me just to come in and quickly cut through and make another loop. Some other tools that are very useful here are the Extrude tool. Shortcut for that one is one that is worth remembering, is the D key. So if I press the D key, you'll see the extrude icon show up here. And so I can extrude out. The I key is inner extrude. Interesting. Grab that loop again. Press the I key. And now when you're using these tools, it's just handy to stay away from your actual selection, because if you accidentally get anywhere near these axis handles, you'll actually pull your selection around. It'll override and you'll do a move instead of whatever the tool is you're using. So just stay out in an empty area within the viewport, and I can enter extrude and then extrude either out or in to begin making complex shapes. Now, these tools work in a couple of different ways. For example, you can use what's called a soft selection. So if I want kind of a more organic transformation, I could come in with the selection key and maybe select a certain group of points, go to the move tool, and you'll see soft selection as an option here. If I enable that, you'll see a hotspot for how this tool operates. So it's going to have a more organic fall off, one that can be set here. So whether I want a dome fall off, a bell fall off, and then I can control the strength and the width. So I can bring these up or down, radius. And now as I transform these, you'll notice they begin to pull surrounding points around there based on that influence. So a lot of these tools allow you to work in that way. And then there's also just some of the higher level modeling tools. If I go back to the M key again, the magnet is a good example of, is a good example of this tool. So you'll see it's the L key when I pull that up. And it allows me to set a radius, and automatically does that type of fall off. And this is a really cool tool. If you don't have anything selected, it'll work on any of the mesh. And so you can do cool things like PLA animation. So if, for example, I set this to frame 90 and turned on point level animation and set a keyframe and then maybe went back to 0 and began to really crunch down this object using the magnet tool, and you can see it's just really got that nice fall off and a real organic tool. And I can do all kinds of things with this. And then once I record that PLA and play it out, it's going to interpolate that animation for me. So it's not only a great tool for modeling, but you can do some really cool PLA animation with it as well. So let me just go back here. And show you a couple more things. So some other tools that you may not often use that are really cool to look at. One of those, let me just get the selection tool. Now you'll see once you've enabled soft selection in any of your tools, it becomes enabled as a mode. So if you want that disabled, you just go to any of your selection tools. You'll see mode set to soft selection. I can turn that back to normal. And so I'm just going to go through here really quickly and shift click a random selection of polygons. Alright, so once I've got that random selection done, I don't want to have any of these in a row here, so let me just control click a few of these off. Maybe add one more, and maybe one more down here. So I've got my selection, and you can use what's a really cool tool, which is called the Matrix Extrude, and you'll find it under the Create tools, and it basically sets up a stepping option for extrusion. So as I extrude out, you'll notice that it also scales down as these step out. And this was one of the first things that I was introduced to by the instructor who taught me, was this, just some of the cool things you could do really quick, and this was one of them. And if I drop this under a HyperNurbs, I can get a really cool looking effect here. And then if I take it a step further and add maybe a sheen shader to it, I can get what looks like a virus or some kind of alien type form right within the shape. So that's just a little bit about the difference between working with objects and working with components, and then also how we can go about selecting those components and then using our transformation tools to both model and animate based on the components.